Picture this. It's 1965, somewhere off the coast of Florida. The sun is beating down on crystal clear water, and beneath the surface, something extraordinary is happening. A young woman floats in a partially flooded house, living in ankle-deep water for 10 weeks straight. She's not a castaway. She's not stranded. She's here by choice. And she's not alone. Swimming beside her, circling her legs, vocalizing in clicks and whistles that echo through the flooded rooms, is a bottlenose dolphin named Peter. This woman, Margaret Howe Lovatt, is attempting something that has never been tried before in the history of our species. She's trying to teach a dolphin to speak English. She's trying to bridge the gap between two intelligent species. She's trying to create a partnership that many scientists believed was not just possible, but inevitable. The experiment was part of a larger project funded by NASA. Yes, NASA. The space agency wasn't interested in dolphins for the sake of marine biology. They were interested because they believed that if we could learn to communicate with an intelligent, non-human species on Earth, it might prepare us for the day we encountered intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. The logic was elegant. Why wait to figure out alien communication when we have intelligent aliens right here in our oceans? But this story doesn't start in 1965. It doesn't even start with humans. To understand why humans and dolphins almost became partners, why we came so incredibly close to forming a cross-species alliance that could have rivaled our bond with dogs, we need to go back much, much further. We need to go back 50 million years to when the ancestors of dolphins made a decision that would put them on a collision course with humanity. We need to understand what dolphins actually are. And trust me, they're far stranger and more remarkable than you probably imagine. Let's start with a fact that blows most people's minds. Dolphins aren't fish. You probably know this already, but have you ever really thought about what it means? Dolphins are mammals. They breathe air. They nurse their young with milk. They're warm-blooded. Their ancestors walked on land. Yes, you read that right. The ancestors of dolphins had 4 legs and walked on solid ground. Around 50 million years ago, these land-dwelling mammals, relatives of modern hippos and whales, began returning to the sea. Over millions of years, their front legs became flippers. Their hind legs disappeared entirely. Their nostrils migrated to the tops of their heads, becoming blowholes, and their bodies streamlined into the sleek, hydrodynamic forms we recognize today. But here's what's crucial. While their bodies were adapting to aquatic life, their brains were doing something unprecedented. They were getting bigger, much bigger, not just in absolute size, but relative to body size. Dolphins evolved some of the largest and most complex brains in the animal kingdom. A bottlenose dolphin's brain weighs about 3.5 pounds, compared to a human brain at about 3 pounds. But it's not just about weight. It's about structure, about complexity, about what that brain can actually do. Dolphin brains have a highly convoluted cerebral cortex, the part associated with higher order thinking. In some measures of cortical complexity, dolphins actually exceed humans. The neocortex, the region associated with conscious thought, spatial reasoning, and sensory perception, is exceptionally well developed in dolphins. They have more cortical neurons in some regions than humans do. Their limbic system, which processes emotions, is also elaborate, suggesting a rich emotional life. But perhaps most remarkably, dolphins have a paralimbic lobe that humans don't have. This region appears to integrate emotional and cognitive processing in ways we're only beginning to understand. Some neuroscientists believe this gives dolphins a form of consciousness that might be fundamentally different from human. Consciousness, not necessarily inferior, just different. Think about what this means. In the oceans of Earth, completely independent of human evolution, another lineage of mammals was evolving sophisticated intelligence. While our ancestors were developing larger brains, on the African savanna, learning to use tools and control fire, dolphins were developing their own form of intelligence in the oceans, adapted to a completely different environment with completely different challenges. And they were successful, incredibly successful. Today, dolphins inhabit every ocean on Earth, from tropical waters to polar seas. There are nearly 40 species of dolphins, ranging from the massive orca or killer whale, which is actually the largest dolphin species, to the small Maui's dolphin, barely 5 feet long. They've adapted to rivers, coastal waters, and the open ocean. They hunt everything from tiny fish to giant squid to other marine mammals. But intelligence isn't just about brain size or survival success. It's about behavior, about what an animal can actually do with that intelligence. And this is where dolphins become truly extraordinary. Dolphins are one of only a handful of species that have demonstrated self-awareness. They can recognize themselves in mirrors, understanding that the reflection is them, not another dolphin. This might sound trivial, but it's not. Mirror self-recognition is considered a marker of sophisticated self-awareness, and very few species possess it. Great apes, elephants, magpies, and dolphins. They use tools. In Shark Bay, Australia, some dolphins wear marine sponges on their rostrums, their beaks, when foraging on the seafloor. The sponges protect them from sharp rocks and stinging animals. What's remarkable is that this behavior is culturally transmitted. Mothers teach it to their daughters, and those daughters teach it to their daughters. It's not instinct. It's learned tradition, passed down through generations. They have names. Individual dolphins develop signature whistles. unique sound patterns that function as names. Other dolphins use these signature whistles to call to specific individuals. If you're a dolphin named, let's say, the equivalent of clicks twice fast, other dolphins will use that exact whistle pattern to get your attention. They're literally calling each other by name. They cooperate in ways that require planning and communication. Dolphins hunt cooperatively, using sophisticated strategies that vary by region and prey type. Some dolphins create mud rings by stirring up sediment with their tails, trapping fish in a cylinder of murky water, then taking turns plunging through to catch the disoriented prey. Others drive fish onto mudflats and then beach themselves temporarily to grab the stranded fish. In Brazil, dolphins have developed a partnership with human fishermen that has lasted for over 150 years. The dolphins drive schools of fish toward the fishermen's nets, and in return, they catch the fish that escape. The dolphins signal to the fishermen when to cast their nets by performing specific behaviors. The fishermen have learned to read these signals. Neither species was formally trained in this. It evolved naturally through observation and mutual benefit. This Brazilian fishing partnership is crucial to our story because it demonstrates something profound. Dolphins are capable of recognizing humans as potential partners. They can understand that we're intelligent, that we have goals, that we can cooperate toward mutual benefit. They can read our behavior and adjust their own accordingly, but it raises a haunting question. If dolphins are this intelligent, if they're capable of cooperation, tool use, self-awareness, and communication, sophisticated enough to include individual names, why didn't we form the same kind of deep partnership with them that we formed with dogs and wolves? Why aren't there dolphins living in our homes, working alongside us, integrated into human society the way dogs are? Why, despite thousands of years of humans living along coastlines, fishing the same waters dolphins hunt in, did we never bridge that gap? The answer to that question is more complex and more tragic than you might imagine. It's a story about missed opportunities and fundamental barriers. It's about what happened when two intelligent species recognized each other across the vast divide of different environments, different evolutionary paths, different ways of experiencing reality. It's about what could have been and what went terribly, tragically wrong. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know where you are in the world. Drop a comment telling me your location and whether you've ever seen dolphins in the wild. There's something profound about the fact that people all over the planet, separated by continents and cultures, have all looked at dolphins and felt that same sense of recognition, that feeling that we're looking at another intelligent mind. Keep that thought with you as we continue this journey, because what comes next will change how you think about intelligence itself, about communication, about the possibilities and limitations of partnership between species. We're about to explore the moments in history when humans and dolphins came closest to truly understanding each other. And we're going to examine why, despite coming so tantalizingly close, the partnership never quite formed. Why the promise of that connection remains unfulfilled to this day. The story begins not in the modern era, but thousands of years ago, in the ancient world, when humans first started seriously wondering about the minds swimming beneath the waves. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with dolphins, not in the way modern people find them cute or interesting, but in a deeper, more profound way. They saw dolphins as sacred, as something that existed in the space between the human and divine worlds. And the more you learn about ancient Greek attitudes toward dolphins, the more you realize they were onto something. In ancient Greek law, killing a dolphin was punishable by death, the same penalty as murdering a human being. Think about that for a moment. In a world where slavery was commonplace, where women had limited rights, where conquered enemies could be slaughtered without consequence, dolphins were protected by the ultimate sanction. This wasn't sentimentality. The Greeks didn't have Disney movies or aquarium shows shaping their views. This protection came from direct observation, from thousands of years of Mediterranean peoples living alongside dolphins and recognizing something extraordinary. The ancient texts are filled with stories of dolphin-human partnerships. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian, recorded numerous accounts of dolphins forming bonds with individual humans. One famous story involves a boy in the town of Baiae, near Naples, who befriended a dolphin he called Simo. Every day, the boy would go to the shore and call out, and the dolphin would appear. The boy would wade into the water, climb onto the dolphin's back, and Simo would carry him across the bay to his school. This went on for years. The entire town knew about it. It wasn't mythology or legend recorded centuries later. It was documented by multiple observers as a contemporary event. When the boy eventually died from illness, Pliny records that the dolphin continued to come to the shore every day, waiting. Eventually, Simo was found, dead on the beach. Ancient observers believed the dolphin had died of grief. Now you might be skeptical. Ancient sources aren't always reliable. Stories get exaggerated. But here's the thing, these stories appear everywhere. Not just in Greek and Roman texts, but in cultures all around the world, separated by vast distances and thousands of years. In New Zealand, the Maori have traditions of dolphins guiding their voyaging canoes to safe harbors. They called dolphins te taniwa, supernatural guardians of the ocean. Maori oral histories contain detailed accounts of dolphins leading lost canoes through dangerous waters, of dolphins warning fishermen about approaching storms, of dolphins protecting swimmers from sharks. Australian Aboriginal peoples have similar stories going back tens of thousands of years. In their traditions, dolphins are messengers between the land and sea worlds, intelligent beings worthy of respect and protection. Rock art sites along the Australian coast show dolphins alongside human figures, suggesting a relationship that extends back into the Pleistocene. In ancient Peru, the Moche culture created elaborate ceramics depicting humans and dolphins interacting. These weren't stylized or symbolic representations. They showed specific, detailed interactions: dolphins approaching, boats, humans reaching out to touch them, scenes that suggest regular, peaceful contact. The Amazon River dolphin, the boto, features prominently in indigenous Brazilian legends. According to these traditions, the boto could transform into a handsome man and walk on land. While obviously mythological, the underlying premise is revealing. The belief that dolphins possessed a form of intelligence and consciousness comparable to humans, that they were, in some fundamental way, people of the water. What's striking about all these traditions from vastly different cultures is the consistency. Dolphins are repeatedly described as intelligent, helpful, communicative, and worthy of moral consideration. These aren't cultures that romanticized nature. Ancient peoples were intimately familiar with the dangers of the natural world. They hunted, fished, and competed with animals for resources. They had no problem killing and eating other marine mammals like seals and whales. But dolphins were different. Almost universally, they were protected, respected, even revered. Why? What were ancient people seeing that made them treat dolphins so differently? The answer lies in direct observation of dolphin behavior. Ancient fishermen spent their entire lives on the water. They watched dolphins every single day in ways that modern people, even marine biologists, rarely do. They saw patterns of behavior that revealed intelligence, intentionality, and something that looked remarkably like moral reasoning. Ancient observers documented dolphins protecting humans from sharks. This isn't mythology. It's been observed and recorded in the modern era as well. Dolphins will surround a human swimmer, keeping sharks at bay through aggressive displays and physical interference. They don't do this because humans are special. They do this because they recognize humans as fellow air-breathing mammals, as beings similar enough to themselves to warrant protection. Ancient fishermen also observed dolphins engaging in what we now call cooperative hunting with humans. In various locations around the Mediterranean, dolphins would drive schools of fish toward fishing boats. The fishermen would catch some fish, and the dolphins would feast on the ones that escaped. This wasn't random. It required both species to recognize the pattern, to understand roles, to anticipate each other's behavior. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote extensively about dolphins in his History of Animals, composed around 350 BCE. His observations are remarkably accurate for someone working without modern scientific instruments. He correctly identified dolphins as air-breathing mammals, not fish. He noted that they nursed their young, that they cared for injured pod members, that they communicated through a variety of sounds. But what's most striking is what Aristotle says about dolphin intelligence. He writes that dolphins have a voice and can make sounds, that they show affection for their young, and most tellingly, that they are gentle and friendly to man. He describes them not as animals in the way he describes other species, but as beings with interior lives, with emotions, with something approaching reason. Oppian, a Greek poet from the 2nd century CE, wrote even more directly about dolphin intelligence. In his work Haleutica, a long poem about fishing, he states, "Diviner than the dolphin is nothing yet created, for, indeed, they were aforetime men, and lived in cities along with mortals. This is extraordinary." Oppian is suggesting that dolphins are, in some essential way, equivalent to humans. Not that they literally used to be human, but that they possess the qualities we associate with humanity: intelligence, social organization, moral capacity. The Romans went further. They built elaborate dolphin mosaics in their villas and public baths, always showing dolphins and humans in harmonious interaction. Roman coins frequently featured dolphins, associating them with protection and safe passage. When the Romans wanted to represent the ideal relationship between humanity and nature, they chose dolphins. But here's where the ancient story becomes puzzling. Despite all this recognition, despite thousands of years of positive interaction, despite treating dolphins as legally and morally significant, ancient peoples never took the next step. They never tried to domesticate dolphins. They never attempted to integrate dolphins into human society the way they did with dogs, horses, and dozens of other species. The Greeks domesticated everything they could get their hands on. They kept elaborate aviaries of exotic birds. They tamed lions and bears for entertainment. They bred horses, dogs, cattle, pigs, chickens, geese. They were masterful at identifying useful animals and bringing them under human control. So why not dolphins? If the Greeks recognized dolphin intelligence, if they had positive relationships with wild dolphins, if they saw the potential for cooperation, why didn't they take it further? The answer reveals something fundamental about the limitations of cross-species partnership, something that would plague every attempt at human-dolphin cooperation throughout history. The barrier wasn't lack of desire. It wasn't lack of recognition of dolphin intelligence. It was something more basic, more insurmountable. It was the water itself. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you meet someone who seems intelligent, friendly, interested in communicating with you. You want to form a partnership with this person. You want to work together, share information, build something meaningful. There's just one problem. They live at the bottom of a well, a very deep well, and they can't come up and you can't go down. Not for long, anyway. You can shout down to them. They can shout up to you. You can drop things down. They can maybe throw things up, but you can't sit together. You can't share a meal. You can't work side by side on a task. You can't live in the same space. Every interaction requires enormous effort and can only last a few minutes before someone has to leave. How deep a partnership could you really build under those constraints? This is the fundamental problem that has prevented humans and dolphins from forming the kind of bond we have with dogs, horses, or any other domesticated animal. It's not about intelligence. It's not about willingness. It's about the basic physics and biology of existing in completely different mediums. Let's start with the most obvious problem. Humans need air, dolphins need water. Well, that's not quite right. Dolphins need air too. They're mammals. They breathe through lungs just like we do. But they need to be water to survive. Their bodies are built for aquatic life in ways that make land existence impossible for more than a few minutes. A dolphin's body is supported by water. On land, their weight crushes their internal organs. The same buoyancy that allows them to swim gracefully becomes a death sentence out of water. A beached dolphin will die not from drowning, but from suffocation and organ failure, as its own body weight compresses its lungs and other organs. They can survive maybe 30 minutes to an hour out of water under ideal conditions. Compare that to the hours or days humans can survive in water, and you see the asymmetry. But let's say we solve that problem. Let's say we keep the dolphin in water and we get in the water with them. Now we face a different set of challenges. Humans are terrible in water. Yes, we can swim. We're actually better swimmers than most terrestrial mammals, but we're nowhere near efficient enough to keep up with dolphins. A dolphin can swim at 20 miles per hour for hours. They can dive to depths of 1,000 feet. They can hold their breath for 15 minutes or more. A highly trained human free diver might reach 400 feet and hold their breath for 5 minutes under ideal conditions. An average person, maybe 30 feet and 1 minute. This means that any interaction between humans and dolphins in the water is severely time limited from the human side. You get a few minutes, then you have to surface. The dolphin is just getting started, and it's not just about duration. It's about comfort and capability. In water, humans are slow, clumsy, and vulnerable. We can't manipulate objects well. Our hands, so useful on land, become nearly useless for fine motor control underwater. We can't use tools effectively. We can't build things. We can't even communicate. Well, which brings us to perhaps the biggest barrier of all: sound. Sound is everything to dolphins. While humans primarily experience the world through vision, dolphins experience it through sound. Their echolocation is so sophisticated that they can see with sound in ways that have no human equivalent. A dolphin can emit clicks and analyze the returning echoes to create a three-dimensional sonic image of their environment. They can tell the difference between different types of fish by their sonic signatures. They can detect a fish buried in sand beneath the seafloor. They can probably see inside other dolphins' bodies, detecting pregnancies, injuries, even emotional states through changes in heart rate and breathing. This is a fundamentally different way of experiencing reality. When two dolphins communicate, they're not just exchanging information. They're sharing perceptual experiences that humans can't access. Imagine trying to describe color to someone who has only ever experienced the world through sound. That's the gulf we're dealing with. And here's where it gets more complicated. Sound works completely differently in water than in air. In water, sound travels nearly 5 times faster than in air. It travels farther with less distortion. This is why dolphins can communicate with each other across miles of ocean. But it also means that the sounds dolphins make are optimized for water, not air. When a dolphin vocalizes in air, we hear something: squeaks, whistles, clicks, but we're hearing a degraded version, like listening to music through a wall. The complexity, the nuance, most of it is lost in the transition between mediums. Similarly, when we speak to dolphins underwater, they're hearing a distorted, incomplete version of our communication. Human language evolved for air. We create complex sounds using our vocal cords, tongue, lips, and teeth. We modulate airflow through our larynx and mouth to create the phonemes that make up words. This entire system stops working underwater. Try talking underwater sometime. It's nearly impossible to create intelligible speech. Dolphins, meanwhile, create sounds using nasal sacs near their blowholes. They don't move their mouths to communicate. Their voice is entirely internal and adapted for underwater sound propagation. They can create clicks at frequencies up to 150 kilohertz. Humans can only hear up to about 20 kilohertz. Much of dolphin communication is literally supersonic to us, completely beyond our perceptual range. Now compare this to the dog-human partnership. Dogs and humans live in the same medium. We breathe the same air. We walk on the same ground. We can sit together for hours. We can work side by side. We can eat together. A human and a dog can share a physical space comfortably, can coordinate actions in real time, can develop routines and patterns that becomes second nature to both. Dogs evolved to read human body language. They watch our faces, our posture, our gestures. They respond to pointing, to facial expressions, to tone of voice. This was possible because we share the same sensory world. We both primarily use vision and sound in air to navigate and communicate. Dolphins can't read human facial expressions underwater. The visual information is too distorted, and we can't read theirs because dolphins don't use facial expressions the way mammals do on land. They communicate through body position, through swimming patterns, through sounds we can barely hear and certainly can't produce. The ancient Greeks recognized all of this implicitly. They didn't have the scientific vocabulary to describe it, but they understood the fundamental barrier. Dolphins were intelligent, friendly, even helpful, but they lived in a different world. A world humans could visit briefly, but never truly inhabit. This is why, despite thousands of years of positive interaction, despite mutual recognition and respect, humans and dolphins never moved beyond a kind of friendly coexistence. We couldn't bring dolphins into our world, and we couldn't enter theirs. The partnership that seemed so promising remained forever at arm's length, or rather at water's depth. But this barrier, as insurmountable as it seemed, didn't stop people from trying to bridge it. Throughout history, there have been individuals who looked at the divide between human and dolphin and thought, there has to be a way. If we're both intelligent, if we both recognize each other, surely we can find a method of true communication, true partnership. The question was, how? For centuries, this remained purely philosophical. Humans lacked the technology to spend extended time in water with dolphins. We lacked the tools to analyze their communication. We lacked even the conceptual frameworks to think scientifically about animal intelligence. But in the 20th century, everything changed. New technologies emerged. New scientific disciplines developed. And for the first time in human history, serious, sustained, well-funded attempts were made to bridge the gap between human and dolphin. What happened next is one of the most fascinating, hopeful, and ultimately heartbreaking chapters in the history of human-animal relations. Because for a brief moment, in the 1960s and 1970s, it looked like we might actually succeed. It looked like humans and dolphins were on the verge of true communication, real partnership. And then it all fell apart. In 1958, a neuroscientist named John C. Lilly did something that would change the course of human-dolphin relations forever. He stuck electrodes into a dolphin's brain. Now, before you recoil in horror, understand the context. Lilly was a legitimate scientist, a medical doctor with degrees from Caltech and the University of Pennsylvania. He'd worked at the National Institutes of Health. He'd made significant contributions to our understanding of brain physiology. He was trying to map which regions of the dolphin brain controlled which functions, the same work he'd done with monkey brains. But something happened during those experiments that Lily didn't expect. Something that changed him, changed his career, and launched the most ambitious attempt at human-dolphin communication in history. The dolphins screamed, not like animals in pain, like something else. The sounds they made when distressed were complex, varied, almost articulated. And more than that, they seemed to be trying to communicate with him. One dolphin, even, while being subjected to brain electrode implantation, tried to mimic the sounds of human speech. Weak, distorted attempts at human words. Lily was shaken to his core. He immediately stopped the brain electrode experiments. He wrote later that he realized he was dealing with something far more than an animal. He was dealing with a mind, an intelligence, possibly even a person. And he decided to dedicate his life to proving it. In 1959, Lilly published a paper that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It was titled Man and Dolphin, and in it, he made an extraordinary claim. Dolphins possessed intelligence comparable to, or possibly exceeding, human intelligence. They had complex language, they had self-awareness, they had culture, and, most provocatively, he claimed that with proper research, humans could learn to communicate with dolphins. Within a decade or two, the timing was perfect. This was the height of the space age. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik. America was rushing to catch up, pouring money into anything that seemed futuristic or scientifically ambitious. The idea of communicating with an alien intelligence captivated the public imagination. And here was a respected scientist saying we didn't need to go to space to find aliens. We had them right here on Earth, swimming in our oceans. The money started flowing. The Navy was interested because they wanted to understand dolphin sonar for submarine detection. NASA was interested because they thought dolphin communication research might prepare us for eventual extraterrestrial contact. Private foundations were interested because this was exactly the kind of bold, transformative science that defined the era. In 1963, Lilly established the Communication Research Institute in the Virgin Islands. It wasn't just a laboratory. It was a vision of the future, a place where the barriers between human and dolphin would finally be broken down. The facility was designed specifically for extended human-dolphin interaction. Flooded rooms where researchers could live partially submerged. Pools designed to facilitate communication experiments. Recording equipment to capture and analyze dolphin vocalizations. Lilly assembled a team of researchers, trainers, and volunteers who shared his vision. These weren't just scientists doing a job. These were believers, people who genuinely thought they were on the verge of one of the most important discoveries in human history. They called themselves the Dolphin people, and they were convinced they were about to change the world. The early experiments were promising, thrilling even. Dolphins demonstrated abilities that shocked even optimistic researchers. They could mimic human speech sounds with surprising accuracy. Not perfectly, their vocal apparatus was too different, but recognizably. A dolphin could hear someone say ball and produce something that sounded like bawl. They could learn to associate specific sounds with specific objects or actions. One dolphin named Elvar learned to produce sounds that approximated hello, ball, and several other words. When Elvar wanted a ball, he would make the ball sound. When humans entered the pool area, he'd make the hello sound. This wasn't just mimicry. This was functional use of learned vocalizations to communicate desires. Another dolphin, Lizzie, learned to perform specific behaviors in response to human words. Not just trained behaviors like jumping or spinning, but complex sequences. Go to the ball and push it to the wall could be communicated through a series of words, and Lizzie would do it. She was understanding symbolic communication, responding to abstract instructions. The researchers noticed something else remarkable. The dolphins seemed to enjoy these sessions. They would voluntarily approach the areas where experiments took place. They would initiate interactions, making sounds, at researchers clearly trying to communicate. This wasn't forced training. The dolphins appeared genuinely interested in bridging the communication gap. Lily started making bold claims. He told journalists that dolphins had a complex language of their own, possibly more sophisticated than human language. He suggested that dolphins might have philosophy, art, even religion. He wrote books with titles like The Mind of the Dolphin and Lily on Dolphins, which became bestsellers. The public was fascinated, but Lily was also becoming increasingly unconventional in his methods. He believed that to truly communicate with dolphins, humans needed to think like dolphins. We needed to break free from our human-centered perspective. And in the 1960s, for a certain type of researcher, that meant one thing: psychedelic drugs. Lilly began experimenting with LSD, both on himself and, controversially, on dolphins. He believed that psychedelics might help both species achieve a kind of cognitive communion, a meeting of minds beyond the constraints of language. He would take LSD and then get in the water with dolphins. He administered LSD to dolphins to see if it would make them more communicative, more willing to bridge the gap. To modern ears, this sounds absurd, even unethical. But in the context of the 1960s, particularly in certain scientific circles, this wasn't seen as completely outrageous. Psychedelic research was happening at major universities. respected scientists were exploring whether these substances might unlock new understanding of consciousness. The dolphin LSD experiments produced mixed results. Some researchers reported profound experiences, feelings of connection with the dolphins that they struggled to articulate. But in terms of measurable communication progress, nothing significant emerged. The dolphins on LSD mostly just seemed confused and distressed. Still, the mainstream work continued. The Communication Research Institute kept producing interesting results. Dolphins were learning more words. They were showing increasingly sophisticated understanding of human communication. And the researchers were learning more about dolphin communication, recording thousands of hours of dolphin vocalizations, beginning to identify patterns and structures. Then came the experiment that would become the most famous and most controversial in the entire history of human dolphin research. The experiment that seemed to promise everything and ended up symbolizing the ultimate failure of the entire project. In 1965, a young woman named Margaret Howe Lovatt agreed to live with a dolphin for 10 weeks. Not just work with a dolphin, live with one. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a flooded house designed specifically for this purpose. The goal was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution: to provide the intensive, constant exposure that human children need to learn language. Margaret would teach a dolphin named Peter to speak English, and Peter would teach Margaret to speak dolphin. They would live together, eat together, play together, sleep in the same space. They would become, in effect, family. The hope was that this would finally crack the code, that this level of immersion would break through all the barriers that had frustrated previous attempts, that humans and dolphins would finally, truly communicate. Margaret moved into the flooded house. Peter swam in. The cameras started rolling, and for 10 weeks, one of the strangest experiments in the history of science unfolded. What happened in that flooded house would fascinate and horrify the world. It would produce genuine breakthroughs in understanding dolphin intelligence. It would also produce scandal, ethical violations, and ultimately tragedy. And it would mark the beginning of the end of humanity's most serious attempt to partner with dolphins. Imagine waking up every morning with water lapping at your ankles. You eat breakfast standing in water. You work at a desk that's partially submerged. You read, write, and try to maintain some semblance of normal human life while constantly wet, constantly aware of the large marine mammal circling your legs, watching you, trying to communicate with you. This was Margaret Howe Lovatt's reality for 10 weeks in 1965. The flooded house was located on the second floor of Lily's Communication Research Institute in the Virgin Islands. It had been specially designed for this experiment. 3 rooms, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a living area, all with about 2 feet of seawater covering the floors. The furniture was raised on platforms. There was a desk for Margaret to work at, a bed she could sleep in while keeping her upper body dry, and equipment for recording everything that happened. Everything. 24 hours a day. Cameras and microphones captured every interaction between Margaret and Peter, the young male bottlenose dolphin who would be her companion, student, and in some ways, her responsibility. Peter was about 5 years old, roughly equivalent to a human teenager in terms of development. He was curious, energetic, and sometimes difficult. He hadn't been raised in captivity from birth, so he still had some of the wildness of a free dolphin. But he'd been at the facility long enough to be comfortable around humans. The first few days were chaos. Peter didn't understand why he was confined to this space with this human. He was used to having other dolphins around. Now it was just Margaret. He became aggressive, biting at her legs, pushing her roughly, making loud vocalizations that sounded almost like complaints. Margaret had been trained by Lily's team, but nothing really prepares you for living with a 400-pound dolphin who's frustrated and confused. She had to establish boundaries. When Peter became too rough, she would leave the water and sit on a raised platform where he couldn't reach her. Timeouts, essentially. Peter quickly learned that aggressive behavior meant Margaret would leave, and he wanted her to stay. Within a week, the dynamic shifted. Peter stopped being aggressive. He started following Margaret around the space, watching what she did. When she sat at her desk working on lesson plans, Peter would float beside her, sometimes resting his head on the platform, just being close. Margaret's daily routine was structured around language lessons. Several times a day, she would sit with Peter and work on sounds. She'd say a word clearly, ball. Then she'd hold up a ball, showing Peter the object. Then she'd encourage Peter to try to make the sound. Dolphins don't have vocal cords like humans. They create sounds using nasal sacs and air passages near their blowholes. This means they can't produce sounds exactly the way we do, but they can approximate. Peter would try. Baoulal he'd produce, breathy and distorted, but recognizable. When he got close, Margaret would praise him enthusiastically, give him the ball, play with him. Positive reinforcement. When he didn't even try, she'd withhold the reward. Basic operant conditioning, but applied to cross-species language learning. What Margaret discovered over those weeks was remarkable. Peter wasn't just mimicking sounds randomly. He was learning to associate sounds with objects and actions. He learned ball, fish, fetch, play. He learned Margaret, his name for her, which he would call out when he wanted her attention. But more than that, Peter started creating his own vocalizations in response to situations. When he was hungry, He'd make a specific sound that wasn't English, wasn't anything Margaret had taught him, but was consistent, his own word for hunger. When he wanted to play, he'd make a different sound. He was developing his own symbolic communication system while simultaneously learning elements of hers. Margaret kept detailed notes. She observed that Peter's attention span for lessons was about 15 to 20 minutes, similar to a human child. After that, he'd become distracted, playful, difficult to work with. So she'd take breaks, play with him, let him just be a dolphin. Then they'd return to lessons. She also noticed that Peter learned better at certain times of day. Morning sessions were productive. Mid-afternoon, he was sluggish, harder to motivate. Evening sessions were mixed, sometimes excellent, sometimes frustrating. Just like humans have chronotypes, optimal times for learning and activity, apparently dolphins do. 2. The breakthrough came in week 3. Margaret was working with Peter on multi-word combinations. She'd say, "Get ball," encouraging Peter to retrieve a ball from across the pool. He'd been doing this reliably for days. But then something new happened. Peter was on the other side of the space. Margaret said, "Peter, get ball." Peter didn't move. He just looked at her. Then he made a sound. It was rough, imperfect, but unmistakable. "Get ball." He wasn't just mimicking after. Margaret said it. He was saying it back to her, like he was asking for clarification, or maybe even refusing, making a statement about the command. Margaret was stunned. She repeated the command. Peter repeated his version, "Get ball." Then he swam over. But he didn't get the ball. He came to Margaret instead and made his play sound. He was expressing his own preference, his own desire, using the communication system they'd been building together. This was no longer just training. This was conversation, however primitive. Peter was using learned vocalizations to express his own intentions, to negotiate with Margaret about what they would do. From that point forward, the experiment took on a different quality. Margaret stopped thinking of herself as a teacher and Peter as a student. They were companions working together to bridge a communication gap. She started responding to Peter's self-generated vocalizations as meaningful communication. When he made his hunger sound, she'd feed him and say, "Fish," reinforcing the association. When he made his play sound, she'd play with him and say, "Play." They developed routines. Every morning, Peter would greet her with a specific whistle pattern. She'd respond with, "Good morning, Peter." He'd try to approximate morning in his breathy, dolphin way. They'd have breakfast together, Margaret eating human food on her platform, Peter catching fish she'd throw to him. They'd have lessons. They'd have free time where Peter would just swim while Margaret worked on notes and reports. They'd have play sessions where Margaret would get fully in the water with him, and Peter would be gentle, careful not to hurt her with his considerable strength. At night, Margaret would get into her raised bed, and Peter would float beside it. Sometimes he'd be restless, swimming around the space, making sounds. Other times he'd be calm, just staying close. Margaret wrote that. She found his presence comforting. After the first week, she couldn't imagine sleeping without hearing his breathing, his occasional vocalizations in the dark. But there were complications. Peter was a young male dolphin, and he was becoming sexually mature. Dolphins have strong sex drives and complex sexual behaviors. In a normal pod, there would be other dolphins to interact with. Here, there was only Margaret. Peter began making sexual advances toward Margaret, increasingly insistent as the weeks went on. This put Margaret in an impossible position. She couldn't just ignore it. Peter would become frustrated, aggressive, unable to focus on lessons. She couldn't leave. That would defeat the purpose of the 24/7 immersion experiment. So she made a decision that would later become the most controversial aspect of the entire project. She accommodated Peter's sexual needs, not through actual intercourse, that was physically impossible anyway, but through manual stimulation. She wrote about this clinically in her notes, framing it as a necessary part of maintaining the working relationship. By providing this release, Peter would calm down and be able to focus on communication work again. To modern readers, this seems shocking, even abusive, but Margaret didn't see it that way. In her mind, she was doing what was necessary to continue the scientific work. Peter wasn't being harmed. He was, if anything, happier and more relaxed afterward. And the alternative was to end the experiment, to waste all the progress they'd made. This is where the story gets complicated, morally and ethically. Because what was happening in that flooded house was simultaneously groundbreaking science and a violation of boundaries that most people would find deeply uncomfortable. But here's what nobody disputes. The communication progress was real. By the end of 10 weeks, Peter had a vocabulary of about 10 to 15 words he could produce somewhat reliably. He understood many more words when Margaret spoke them. He was using vocalizations functionally to communicate desires and respond to situations. Margaret had also learned to understand many of Peter's natural vocalizations. She could tell when he was happy, frustrated, curious, tired, hungry. She could predict his behavior based on his sounds and body language. They had developed, if not a shared language, at least a mutual understanding. When the 10 weeks ended, Margaret didn't want to leave. Peter didn't want her to go. But the experiment had to end. Margaret packed up her notes and recordings. Peter was returned to the main pool with other dolphins. And then everything went wrong. The funding dried up first. That's how these things usually end. Not with a dramatic revelation or a more awakening, but with accountants looking at spreadsheets. and deciding the numbers don't justify continued investment. NASA had been one of the primary funders of Lilly's Communication Research Institute. But by 1966, NASA was facing its own budget pressures. The Apollo program was consuming enormous resources. The agency needed to justify every dollar spent. And when administrators looked at the Dolphin communication project, they saw something that was interesting but not essential. The research had produced fascinating results, yes, but nothing that directly contributed to space exploration. The funding was cut. The Navy had been the other major source of money. They were interested in dolphin sonar, in potentially training dolphins for military purposes. But they wanted practical applications, not abstract communication. Research. When they realized that Lilly was more interested in philosophy and consciousness than in military utility, they pulled their support too. Without NASA and Navy funding, the Communication Research Institute was financially doomed. By late 1966, the facility was operating on fumes, burning through what little reserves remained. Staff were being laid off. Dolphins were being transferred to other facilities. The grand experiment was winding down. But the real crisis wasn't financial. It was what happened to Peter. When Margaret left after the 10-week immersion experiment, Peter was moved back to the main pool with other dolphins. He should have been fine. Dolphins are social animals. Being with his own kind should have been positive, even relieving after weeks of isolation with a human. But Peter didn't readjust. He became withdrawn, lethargic. He stopped interacting with the other dolphins. He stopped eating regularly. The trainers noticed he would float at the surface for hours, barely moving, making occasional sounds that researchers who'd worked with him recognized as the vocalizations he'd used with Margaret. He was calling for her. Margaret wanted to return, to spend more time with Peter, to ease his transition. But the Institute was in chaos. Lilly was increasingly erratic, spending more time with his psychedelic research than with the dolphins. The remaining staff were scrambling to figure out what would happen to the animals as the facility shut down. Then came the decision that would haunt everyone involved. The Institute couldn't maintain the facility. The dolphins needed to be relocated. But where? Other facilities had limited space, and Peter, having been raised in shallow, sunlit pools, wasn't adapted for the deeper, darker tanks at most marine facilities. The decision was made to transfer Peter, along with several other dolphins, to a facility in Miami. The conditions there were suboptimal. The pool was smaller, darker, colder than what Peter was used to. But it was the only option available. Peter was transported to Miami in March 1968. Within weeks, he stopped eating entirely. He became almost catatonic, barely responding to trainers. They tried everything: different foods, familiar sounds and objects from the Virgin Islands facility, constant human attention. Nothing worked. Then, on a morning in early May, a trainer found Peter at the bottom of the pool. Dolphins are conscious breathers, unlike humans who breathe automatically even while sleeping. Dolphins have to consciously decide to take each breath. They can't breathe while unconscious. This means that if a dolphin is determined enough, if it's in enough distress, it can simply stop breathing. It can choose to die. That's what Peter did. He sank to the bottom of the pool and stopped surfacing for air. By the time trainers realized what was happening and tried to force him to the surface, it was too late. Peter drowned, or more accurately, Peter committed suicide. Margaret was devastated when she learned. She blamed herself, blamed Lily, blamed the system that had created the bond, and then severed it so carelessly. She wrote later that Peter had been a person in every way that mattered, and they had treated him like property, moving him around based on convenience and budget constraints. They had given him a relationship and then taken it away without considering what that would do to him. The scientific community's reaction to Peter's death was mixed. Some researchers were sympathetic, seeing it as evidence of just how deep dolphin emotions and attachments could go. Others were critical, arguing that the experiment had been unethical from the start, that forming such an intense bond with a captive animal was irresponsible. But the broader public never learned the full story. The Communication Research Institute's collapse wasn't covered extensively in the media. Peter's death wasn't reported in major newspapers. The whole project just quietly faded away, leaving behind boxes of notes, hours of recordings, and a handful of people who knew that something extraordinary had almost happened. Lilly continued his research, but he became increasingly focused on consciousness expansion and psychedelics, rather than rigorous dolphin communication work. He wrote books that blended science with mysticism, claiming dolphins were enlightened beings who could teach humans about higher consciousness. The scientific establishment distanced itself from him. By the 1970s, Lilly was seen as a brilliant mind who'd gone off the deep end, more interested in New Age philosophy than legitimate research. The recordings and notes from Margaret's experiment with Peter sat in archives, rarely examined. The lessons, learned both scientific and ethical, weren't widely disseminated. The whole project became a footnote in the history of animal intelligence research, remembered more for its controversial aspects than for its genuine discoveries. But the work had revealed something undeniable. Dolphins were capable of far more sophisticated communication and emotional bonding than most scientists had believed. Peter had learned elements of human language. He had formed a genuine attachment to Margaret. He had demonstrated preferences, personality, and, ultimately, the capacity for profound grief. The question was, what should humanity do with this knowledge? Some argued that the experiments proved dolphins should never be kept in captivity. That creatures this, intelligent and emotionally complex, couldn't ethically be confined for human purposes. Others argued that we should redouble our efforts at communication, but with better ethics, better conditions, better consideration for dolphin welfare. Instead, we did something else entirely. We turned dolphins into entertainment. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as serious dolphin communication research collapsed, commercial marine parks exploded, SeaWorld opened locations across America. Dozens of smaller facilities sprang up, all featuring dolphin shows. The dolphins would jump through hoops, balance balls on their noses, pull trainers around pools, and splash audiences on cue. The shows were presented as educational, as opportunities for the public to appreciate dolphin intelligence. But there was no real attempt at communication, no effort to understand dolphin language or perspective. The dolphins were trained through simple operant conditioning to perform behaviors that audiences found entertaining. Their intelligence was being used to make them better performers, not to bridge the communication gap. This was the bitter irony. The research had proved dolphins were intelligent enough to potentially communicate with humans, to form genuine relationships, to be something more than animals to us. And our response was to put them in tanks and make them do tricks for crowds. There were exceptions. Some researchers continued serious work on dolphin cognition and communication. Lou Herman at the University of Hawaii developed sophisticated experiments showing that dolphins could understand complex syntactic structures. Diana Rios demonstrated that dolphins could use symbols and even showed evidence of self-recognition in mirrors. But none of this work recaptured the ambition of Lily's project. Nobody was trying to actually live with dolphins to build the kind of deep, sustained partnership that Margaret and Peter had briefly achieved. The funding wasn't there. The institutional support wasn't there. And after what happened to Peter, the ethical questions loomed too large. By the 1980s, the dream of human-dolphin partnership was effectively dead. Not because it had been proven impossible, but because the one serious attempt had ended in tragedy and scandal. The field was tainted. Researchers who wanted to work on dolphin intelligence focused on safe, controlled experiments that could be published in peer-reviewed journals. Nobody wanted to risk their career on the kind of bold, unconventional work that Lily had pioneered. And yet, the dolphins themselves kept showing us what we were missing. In the wild, researchers documented increasingly sophisticated dolphin behavior. cooperative hunting strategies that required planning and communication, cultural transmission of behaviors across generations, regional dialects in dolphin vocalizations, even possible evidence of dolphins giving each other gifts and engaging in behaviors that looked remarkably like play for its own sake, like art. The intelligence was there. The willingness to interact with humans was there, in various locations around the world. Wild dolphins continued to approach humans, to interact peacefully, even helpfully. The Brazilian fishing partnership continued, passed down through dolphin generations, who taught their young to work with human fishermen. But the momentum for creating a real human-dolphin partnership, for bridging the communication gap in a meaningful way, was gone. We had come so close. For a brief moment in the 1960s, it looked like we were on the verge of something revolutionary, and then we lost it. The question that haunted everyone who'd been involved was simple but painful. Could it have worked if we'd done things differently, with better ethics, more resources, more patience? Could humans and dolphins have become true partners? We'll never know, because we never really tried again. But here's the thing about scientific knowledge. Even when experiments fail, even when projects collapse, the data remains. The observations stay valid. And in the decades since Lily's ambitious project fell apart, scientists have continued quietly piecing together what dolphins actually are, what they're actually capable of, and why. The communication barrier is both more complex and potentially more surmountable than we thought. Let's start with what we now know for certain about dolphin intelligence. Not speculation, not hopeful projection, but verified, replicated scientific findings. First, dolphins possess metacognition. They know what they know. In experiments conducted by researcher Stan Cuxedge and others, dolphins were given tasks where they had to choose between attempting a difficult challenge or passing to an easier option. The crucial detail: they could only see partial information before making the choice. Dolphins consistently demonstrated the ability to assess their own uncertainty. If they weren't sure they could complete the hard task, they'd choose the easier option. If they were confident, they'd go for the challenge. This might not sound impressive, but think about what it requires. The dolphin has to think about its own thinking. It has to evaluate its own knowledge state. This is metacognition, and it's vanishingly rare in the animal kingdom. Humans have it, great apes have it, some corvids might have it, and dolphins definitely have it. Second, dolphins have episodic memory. They can remember specific events from their past and recall them in detail. In experiments at the Dolphin Research Center in Florida, dolphins were taught a behavior and then, without warning, asked to repeat it days or even weeks later. They could do it more impressively when asked to repeat something. dolphins would recreate behaviors they'd invented themselves during free play sessions, behaviors no human had taught them. They were reaching into their memory of specific past events and reproducing them. Third, dolphins understand abstract concepts. Lou Herman's work in Hawaii demonstrated this conclusively. Dolphins learned an artificial language using gestures and sounds. But they didn't just learn word object associations. They understood syntax, the order of words mattering. Ball, fetch, hoop meant something different from hoop, fetch, ball, and dolphins responded appropriately to both. They understood agent-action-object relationships. They could follow instructions involving objects they couldn't even see, using memory and spatial reasoning. One dolphin named Akakam understood over 60 words and could follow instructions, combining them in thousands of novel ways. When given instructions she'd never heard before, instructions that combined familiar words in new sequences, she'd pause, process, and then execute the correct behavior. She was using grammar, understanding that the structure of communication carries meaning independent of the individual symbols. Fourth, dolphins have culture. Not metaphorical culture, but the scientific definition. Learned behaviors passed down through generations, varying by region, with no genetic basis. Researchers studying dolphins in Shark Bay, Australia, have documented at least 7 distinct foraging techniques used by different dolphin groups. The sponging behavior I mentioned earlier, where dolphins wear sponges on their rostrums while foraging, is practiced by one group, but not others living just a few miles away. This behavior is taught from mother to daughter and persists across generations. Even more remarkably, dolphins have regional dialects. Their signature whistles, those individual names, are influenced by the local acoustic environment and social group. A dolphin from the Mediterranean sounds different from a dolphin from the Caribbean, even though they're the same species. They're learning their communication patterns from their social group, just like human children learn accents from the people around them. Fifth, dolphins demonstrate empathy and helping behavior toward other species. There are numerous documented cases of dolphins protecting humans from sharks, supporting injured or exhausted swimmers to the surface, even guiding lost boats to shore. Initially, scientists were skeptical of these reports, thinking them exaggerated or misinterpreted. But the evidence is overwhelming and often captured on video. In 2004, a group of dolphins in New Zealand surrounded 4 swimmers and began herding them. The swimmers were confused until they saw a great white shark circling below. The dolphins maintained their protective formation for 40 minutes until the shark left. One of the swimmers was a marine biologist who documented the incident. The dolphins weren't protecting their young or their food. They were protecting members of another species because they recognized those individuals were in danger. This isn't instinct. This is moral reasoning, recognizing another being's distress and choosing to intervene at potential cost to themselves. But here's where the science gets really interesting. In the last 2 decades, we've begun to understand dolphin communication in ways that the 1960s researchers couldn't. We have better recording equipment, better analysis, tools, and most importantly, artificial intelligence that can detect patterns in data that humans would never notice. Research by Denise Herzing and the Wild Dolphin Project has revealed that dolphin communication is staggeringly complex. Dolphins produce clicks, whistles, burst pulse sounds, and combinations thereof. Each type of vocalization serves different functions. Echolocation clicks for navigation and hunting. Signature whistles for identification and maintaining social contact. Burst pulse sounds that seem to carry emotional content, but the real complexity is in how these sounds combine. Dolphins don't just make individual sounds. They create sequences, patterns, overlapping vocalizations where multiple dolphins are speaking simultaneously. When you analyze these vocalizations with spectral analysis, looking at the frequency patterns over time, you see structure, repeating motifs, call and response patterns, elements that look remarkably like syntax. Here's where it gets wild. Using machine learning algorithms, researchers have identified what appear to be words in dolphin communication, not just signature whistles, but other repeating sound patterns that occur in specific contexts. There's a burst pulse pattern that appears frequently when dolphins are hunting cooperatively, another pattern associated with play behavior, another with aggressive encounters. The dolphins aren't just making noise. They're encoding information in sound in systematic, structured ways. They have, in effect, language. Not necessarily like human language, but recognizably linguistic in its structure and function. So if dolphins have language, if they have culture, if they have metacognition and empathy, and all these markers of sophisticated intelligence, why haven't we cracked the communication code? Why, with all our modern technology, haven't we achieved what Lilly dreamed of in the 1960s? The answer is simultaneously simple and profound. We're asking the wrong question. We keep trying to teach dolphins human language or to decode their language into human terms. But dolphin communication evolved for a completely different environment and a completely different sensory system. Their language isn't just encoded in sound. It's encoded in echolocation, in three-dimensional spatial information, in sonic images that we can't perceive or produce. When a dolphin echolocates, it's not just sensing the environment. It's potentially sharing that sensory information with other dolphins. Imagine if every time you spoke, you could transmit not just words, but actual images of what you're seeing. That's closer to what dolphins might be doing. Their communication might be fundamentally visual in a way we never imagined because the images are made of sound. Recent research by Jack Kasiewicz has demonstrated something remarkable. When you play a dolphin's echolocation sounds through a device called a cymoscope, which visualizes sound as geometric patterns, you can see images, actual pictures of what the dolphin was echolocating. A fish produces one pattern, a person produces another. Different objects create different sonic images. Now imagine dolphins can do this naturally. When one dolphin echolocates an object and another dolphin hears it, that second dolphin might see what the first dolphin sensed. This would be a completely alien form of communication, more like telepathically sharing sensory experiences than anything resembling human language. This means that the communication barrier between humans and dolphins isn't just about learning vocabulary or grammar. It's about bridging fundamentally different ways of experiencing and encoding reality. We think in words and visual images. Dolphins might think in sonic pictures, in three-dimensional sound sculptures, in patterns of information that have no equivalent in human experience. But here's the hopeful part. We're starting to understand this. We have technology now that can analyze and even visualize what dolphin communication might look like from their perspective. We have AI that can find patterns in data too complex for human analysis. We have underwater communication devices that could potentially allow humans to echolocate, to experience something closer to the dolphin's sensory world. The tools exist now that didn't exist in the 1960s. The understanding exists. The question is, do we have the will to try again? And if we do, can we do it ethically, without repeating the mistakes that led to Peter's death and the collapse of the original dream? Because there's another revelation from all this research, one that makes the ethical questions even more urgent. Dolphins aren't just intelligent. They might be persons. The word person carries enormous weight. In law, in philosophy, in ethics, being a person means something specific. It means you have rights. It means you can't be owned as property. It means your welfare matters in a fundamental way, not because someone cares about you, but because you have inherent moral value. For most of human history, we've reserved personhood exclusively for humans. Even that boundary was flexible. Various cultures and legal systems have denied personhood to slaves, to women, to children, to people of certain ethnic groups. The circle of who counts as a person has gradually expanded over centuries, but it's always remained within our species until now. Because the scientific evidence about dolphin cognition has forced philosophers, ethicists, and even some legal scholars to ask an uncomfortable question. If personhood is based on cognitive capacities like self-awareness, emotional depth, communication ability, and moral reasoning, and dolphins possess all of these, then aren't dolphins persons? This isn't a fringe position anymore. In 2010, a group of prominent scientists and ethicists issued the Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans, specifically whales and dolphins. The declaration stated that cetaceans should be regarded as non-human persons with the right to life, liberty, and well-being. It called for an end to dolphin captivity, to hunting, to any use of cetaceans that treats them as resources rather than individuals. The declaration was signed by leading cognitive scientists, marine biologists, and philosophers. These weren't animal rights activists making emotional arguments. These were researchers who'd spent careers studying dolphin cognition, concluding that the evidence demanded a radical shift in how we think about these animals. Thomas White, a philosopher who's written extensively on this topic, argues that dolphins meet every reasonable criteria for personhood. They're self-aware, passing the mirror test that most animals fail. They have complex emotional lives, showing evidence of joy, grief, frustration, and even what appears to be depression. They communicate using sophisticated, learned systems. They have individual personalities, distinct preferences and behaviors that remain consistent throughout their lives. They form long-term relationships with specific individuals that last decades. Most compellingly, dolphins demonstrate what White calls moral agency. They make choices that consider the welfare of others, even at cost to themselves. When a dolphin protects a swimmer from a shark, it's making a moral choice. When dolphin mothers teach their young complex skills with patience and attention, they're demonstrating care that goes beyond genetic programming. When dolphins have been observed supporting sick or injured pod members for weeks, keeping them afloat so they can breathe, they're showing something that looks exactly like compassion. If we accept that these cognitive and emotional capacities are what make humans persons, then consistency demands we extend the same recognition to other beings with similar capacities. And dolphins, the research shows, have them. But here's where this stops being an abstract philosophical question and becomes searingly practical. Because if dolphins are persons, what does that mean for the hundreds of dolphins currently living in captivity? There are roughly 3,000 dolphins in captivity worldwide, living in marine parks, aquariums, research facilities, and military programs. They perform in shows, participate in swim with dolphin experiences, live in tanks that, even in the best facilities, are microscopic compared to the hundreds of square miles a wild dolphin might travel in a single day. If dolphins are persons, then keeping them in captivity isn't animal husbandry. It's imprisonment without trial. It's kidnapping if they were captured from the wild. It's forced labor if they're made to perform for audiences. Every dolphin in a tank is a person whose freedom has been taken away, who lives in conditions that would be considered torture if applied to a human. The marine park industry argues that captive dolphins are well cared for, that they receive medical attention, regular food, protection from predators. And this is true in the same way that a human prisoner receives meals and medical care. But no human would consider a life in prison acceptable merely because their basic needs were met. We recognize that freedom, autonomy, and the ability to live according to one's nature are fundamental rights for persons. The counter-argument from the industry is that captive dolphins appear happy. They play, they interact with trainers, they perform behaviors that suggest contentment. But the research on dolphin cognition complicates this picture dramatically. Remember how I mentioned that dolphins are conscious breathers. They choose every breath they take. This means that suicide is always an option for them. Richard O'Barry, a former dolphin trainer who captured and trained the dolphins for the TV show Flipper, became an anti-captivity activist after one of those dolphins, Kathy, died in his arms. He claims she looked him in the eye, took a breath, and then chose not to take another. She committed suicide, O'Barry believes, because she couldn't bear captivity anymore. The marine park industry disputes O'Barry's interpretation. They say Kathy died of natural causes, that the stress explanation is emotional anthropomorphism. But given what we now know about dolphin cognition, about their metacognitive abilities and emotional depth, can we really dismiss the possibility that a dolphin might choose death over continued captivity? Peter did. After being separated from Margaret and moved to suboptimal conditions, Peter stopped breathing. The trainers who found him believed it was a choice. And he's not the only documented case. There are numerous reports of captive dolphins who stopped eating, who became lethargic and unresponsive, who seemed to give up on life. If these are persons, then these aren't just animal deaths. These are tragedies. These are individuals who suffered so profoundly that they chose non-existence over their circumstances. The personhood question also forces us to reconsider research practices. Even the most well-intentioned dolphin research, the kind focused on understanding their cognition and communication, requires keeping dolphins in controlled environments where they can be studied. But if dolphins are persons, then conducting research on them without their meaningful consent is unethical, no matter how gentle the methods. This is the paradox we face. To learn enough about dolphins to recognize them as persons requires studying them in ways that might be unethical if they are persons. We're caught in a philosophical catch-22. Some researchers argue that the solution is to focus entirely on studying wild dolphins in their natural environments. Projects like the Wild Dolphin Project, run by Denise Herzing, have spent decades observing wild Atlantic spotted dolphins without capturing them or interfering with their lives. This research has produced valuable insights while respecting dolphin autonomy, but wild research has limitations. You can't do controlled experiments. You can't test specific hypotheses about cognition or communication. The observations are opportunistic, dependent on when and where dolphins choose to interact with researchers. The kind of intensive, sustained contact that produced breakthroughs in understanding dolphin intelligence, like Margaret's work with Peter, requires captivity, or at least semi-captivity. So we face an impossible choice: to understand dolphins well enough to advocate effectively for their personhood. We may need to keep some dolphins in conditions that violate their personhood. To respect their autonomy fully, we may have to accept limitations on our knowledge that leave them vulnerable to exploitation, because we can't prove definitively what they are. Some jurisdictions have started making legal moves toward recognizing dolphin personhood. India declared dolphins non-human persons in 2013, banning captivity and performances. Costa Rica passed similar legislation. The European Parliament has considered measures that would effectively recognize cetacean rights, though implementation has been slow. But most of the world still treats dolphins as animals, as property, as resources to be used for entertainment, research, or military purposes. The disconnect between what the science reveals and how we treat dolphins grows wider every year. And this brings us back to the original question: why didn't humans and dolphins become partners? We now have part of the answer. The partnership was impossible, not because dolphins lack intelligence or willingness, but because true partnership requires recognizing the other as an equal. And we've never been willing to do that. We wanted dolphins to be smart enough to be useful, but not so self-aware that enslaving them would be wrong. We wanted them to be capable of communication, but not so sophisticated that we'd have to consider their refusal to participate. We wanted them to be companions, but not persons with rights that would limit what we could do with them. The dogs we partnered with were pack animals who evolved to defer to hierarchy, who were small enough to live in our spaces, who could survive on our food. They could be domesticated because domestication didn't require denying their nature. A dog can be happy living with humans because pack life, territoriality, and social bonding are core to dog nature. But dolphins are not pack animals in that sense. They're sophisticated, autonomous individuals who form complex social networks spanning entire oceans. They have their own cultures, their own communication systems, their own ways of being that don't map onto human social structures. To truly partner with us, they would have to give up what makes them dolphins. And we've never figured out how to partner with another species without requiring them to subordinate their nature to ours. This is the tragedy at the heart of the story. The partnership failed not because it was impossible, but because it would have required us to meet dolphins as equals. And we've never been willing to do that with any other species, not even with humans who are different from us historically. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. One more reason why the partnership never happened, even beyond the ethical considerations. A reason that's both more practical and more fundamental than anything we've discussed so far. Let me tell you about a moment that encapsulates everything. It's 2011 off the coast of Hawaii. A team of researchers is in the water with a group of spinner dolphins. One dolphin approaches the lead researcher, woman who's been studying these particular dolphins for years. The dolphin knows her, recognizes her, has interacted with her dozens of times. The dolphin swims close, looks directly at the researcher, and begins vocalizing. Not randomly, but with clear intentionality. The body language suggesting this is directed communication. The dolphin produces a complex series of whistles and clicks, then pauses, waiting. The researcher has underwater recording equipment, captures everything, but in the moment, she can't respond in kind. She can't produce the sounds dolphins use. She can't echolocate. She can only float there, understanding that communication is happening, but unable to participate. The dolphin waits for a moment, then repeats the vocalization. It's clearly trying to communicate something. There's intent, there's expectation of response. But the human can't provide what the dolphin is asking for. After a third attempt, the dolphin seems to give up. It swims away, rejoining its pod. Later, back on the research vessel, the team analyzes the recording. They identify parts of the dolphin's signature whistle, some burst pulse sounds associated with greeting behaviors, and several elements they can't classify. Was the dolphin trying to introduce itself, ask a question, share information about something it had encountered? They'll never know. The moment of potential communication passed, and the message, whatever it was, remains untranslated. This is the fundamental problem. Not ethics, not intelligence, not willingness, but the simple, brutal fact that humans and dolphins experience reality in such profoundly different ways that true mutual understanding might be genuinely impossible. Let's break this down to its components. Start with sensory experience. Humans are primarily visual creatures. About 30% of our cerebral cortex is dedicated to processing visual information. We think in images, in spatial relationships, in colors and shapes. Our language reflects this. We say, I see what you mean. We look at problems. We have a vision for the future. Our entire conceptual framework is built on visual metaphors. Dolphins are primarily acoustic creatures. Their world is made of sound. When a dolphin navigates, it's not seeing the environment in the way we understand vision. It's building a sonic map, a three-dimensional representation constructed entirely from echoes. The level of detail they can perceive through echolocation exceeds human vision in many ways. They can detect a fish buried 6 inches under sand. They can identify different species of fish by their swim bladder resonance. They can probably sense the internal organs of other dolphins, hearing their heartbeats, detecting pregnancies, identifying stress through changes in breathing patterns. Now try to imagine explaining color to someone who experiences the world entirely through sound. Not just describing it, but making them understand what the experience of seeing red actually is. You can't. The sensory modality is too different. There's no translation. This is the gulf between human and dolphin communication. We're not just speaking different languages. We're describing fundamentally different types of experiences. When a dolphin talks about something it has echolocated, it's describing sensory information we cannot perceive. When we try to describe something we've seen, we're referencing experiences the dolphin cannot share. But it gets worse. Dolphins exist in a three-dimensional medium in a way humans never do. Yes, we can move. In 3 dimensions, we can climb, we can dive. But our lives are fundamentally 2-dimensional. We walk on surfaces. Even our buildings, our cities, our entire civilization is built on the concept of ground and up. We have floors and ceilings. We have north, south, east, west. We navigate in essentially 2 dimensions with occasional vertical movement. Dolphins have no ground. The ocean is fully 3-dimensional, and dolphins use all of it. They can be at the surface, dive to depth, spiral, loop, navigate in ways that have no human equivalent. Their spatial reasoning evolved for this environment. When dolphins communicate about location, about movement, about where prey is or where danger lurks, they're thinking in truly 3-dimensional terms that humans struggle to conceptualize. Research on dolphin cognition has revealed that they solve spatial problems differently than humans. They don't think in terms of left and right, forward and backward. Their navigation is more about depth, current, and sonic reference points. They can maintain awareness of their position relative to multiple points in 3-dimensional space simultaneously. Humans can learn to think this way with extensive training. Pilots and deep-sea divers develop some of these skills, but it's not native to us. For dolphins, it's baseline reality. Then there's the issue of time perception. Humans experience time in a relatively linear way. We have strong distinctions between past, present, and future. Our language encodes tense, the temporal location of events. We plan, we remember, we project into tomorrow. Dolphins may experience time differently. Their echolocation gives them near instantaneous feedback about their environment. The delay between a click and its echo returning is measured in milliseconds. They process sound at frequencies and speeds that humans can't match. Some researchers theorize that dolphins might perceive time with much finer granularity than we do, that what feels like a moment to us might feel much longer to them, filled with more sensory information, more processing. If this is true, then the very pace of human-dolphin communication is mismatched. We might be speaking too slowly for them, taking too long to form responses. Or from another perspective, they might be communicating too rapidly for us to parse, encoding more information in a brief vocalization than we can process in real time. And we haven't even touched on the social structure problem. Humans form hierarchical societies. We have leaders and followers, authorities and subordinates, parents and children in relationships defined by power and dependence. Even in our most egalitarian social structures, we maintain rankings, status differences, roles that define who can make decisions and who must follow them. Dolphin societies are fluid, non-hierarchical in the way human societies are. They have temporary leadership based on experience and context, but nothing resembling human authority structures. A dolphin who leads a hunt today might follow tomorrow. Relationships are based on cooperation and mutual benefit, not on dominance and submission. This means that the entire concept of partnership, as humans understand it, might not translate. When we partnered with dogs, we fit them into our hierarchical social structure. We became their pack leaders. They followed our commands. The relationship worked because dogs evolved to understand and accept hierarchy. But dolphins don't work that way. A true dolphin-human partnership would require humans to think in terms of fluid, egalitarian cooperation without the structure of leadership and obedience. We'd have to negotiate each action, each decision, treating the dolphin as a fully autonomous equal. Most humans struggle to do this even with other humans. There's also the problem of life history. Dogs live with us. They eat when we eat, sleep when we sleep, go where we go. Our daily rhythms align. A human and a dog can build a life together because they're experiencing time at the same scale. Dolphins live on a completely different schedule. They don't sleep the way we do. They rest half their brain at a time, remaining partially conscious to breathe. They don't have meals. They hunt and eat throughout the day. They don't stay in one place. They're constantly moving, covering vast distances. There's no way for a human to match this lifestyle. We can't spend 24 hours in water We can't swim continuously. We can't hold our breath long enough to accompany dolphins on their dives. Margaret and Peter came closest to solving this problem by creating an artificial environment where both species could exist simultaneously, but it was a compromise that satisfied neither. Margaret was always wet, always uncomfortable, always limited in what she could do. Peter was confined to a tiny space, unable to dive, unable to swim at speed, unable to live anything like a normal dolphin life. The dogs who became our partners adapted to our environment. We didn't have to adapt to theirs. But dolphins can't adapt to our environment, and we can't adapt to theirs. The environmental barrier that seemed surmountable turns out to be absolute. Even with all our technology, even with underwater habitats and scuba gear and submarines, we remain visitors. To the ocean, we can stay for hours, maybe days with the right equipment, but we can never truly live there. And dolphins can never truly live in our world. This is why the partnership failed. Not because we didn't try hard enough, not because we weren't smart enough, not even primarily because of ethical failures, though those mattered. The partnership failed because humans and dolphins are separated by gulfs of perception, cognition, and environment that may be genuinely unbridgeable. We evolved on different paths, adapted for different worlds, developed different ways of being intelligent, different ways of experiencing reality. We recognized each other as intelligent. We even, for brief moments, connected. But connection isn't partnership. Understanding that another being is intelligent isn't the same as being able to build a life together. The tragedy is that we came so close, close enough to see what might have been, close enough to recognize what we were losing, close enough that some humans and some dolphins formed genuine bonds that mattered to both. And then we had to accept what should have been obvious from the start. Some gulfs can't be crossed. Some partnerships, no matter how desirable, no matter how theoretically possible, can't survive the reality of what each species fundamentally is. But that doesn't mean the story ends here. Because even though we couldn't become partners, that doesn't erase what we learned. It doesn't undo the significance of knowing that we're not alone on this planet as intelligent, self-aware beings. And it raises profound questions about what we owe to the other minds swimming in our oceans, even if we can never truly understand them. There's a question that haunts everyone who studies this history. What if we had succeeded? What if, somehow, we'd bridged that gulf? What if humans and dolphins had become partners in the way humans and dogs did? Imagine that world for a moment. Imagine coastal cities where dolphins work alongside human fishermen, not exploited, but as equals sharing in the catch. Imagine rescue operations where dolphins guide lost swimmers to safety, where they patrol beaches warning of dangerous currents and predators. Imagine scientific exploration, where dolphins serve as our ambassadors to the deep ocean, places humans can barely visit, but dolphins call home. Imagine, most powerfully, what it would mean psychologically and philosophically for humanity to have another intelligent species we could genuinely communicate with. To know, not theoretically, but experientially, that intelligence and consciousness aren't unique to humans. To grow up in a world where talking to another species is normal, where crossing that boundary is something every child learns to do. How would that change us? How would it reshape our sense of ourselves, our place in nature, our understanding of what consciousness is? Would we be less lonely as a species? Would we be more humble, knowing that we're not the only minds on Earth sophisticated enough to ponder existence? We'll never know. That world doesn't exist. The partnership that seemed so tantalizingly possible in those heady days of the 1960s never materialized. And now we know why. The barriers weren't just technological or ethical. They were fundamental, rooted in the basic architecture of how each species experiences reality. But here's what we did get, what we did learn, and it's not nothing. We learned that intelligence isn't singular. It's not a ladder with humans at the top and everything else arranged below us. It's a landscape with different peaks, different forms of sophisticated cognition that evolved to solve different problems in different environments. Dolphin intelligence isn't less than human intelligence. It's different. They excel at spatial reasoning in 3 dimensions. They process acoustic information in ways that shame our auditory capabilities. They maintain complex social relationships across vast distances and long timescales. They teach, they learn, they create culture, they make moral choices. We learned that consciousness exists in forms radically different from our own. When you look into a dolphin's eye, when you see that clear recognition, that awareness looking back at you, you're encountering another way of being conscious. Not human consciousness translated into a dolphin body, but dolphin consciousness shaped by 50 million years of separate evolution, by life in a medium we can barely survive in, by sensory experiences we can't imagine. This matters. It matters philosophically, forcing us to expand our definition of personhood beyond our own species. It matters scientifically, showing us that convergent evolution can produce intelligence through completely different neural architectures. It matters ethically, demanding that we consider the welfare of beings whose minds we can recognize even if we can't fully understand them. And it matters emotionally, because knowing that we're not alone, that Earth produced at least 2 lineages of sophisticated intelligence, changes something fundamental about how we see ourselves and our world. We're not the singular miracle. We're part of a pattern, one expression of what's possible when evolution selects for complex cognition. So what do we owe dolphins now, given what we know? Given that partnership proved impossible, but personhood seems undeniable. First, we owe them freedom. The era of keeping dolphins in tanks for entertainment needs to end. Not gradually, not when it becomes economically inconvenient for marine parks, but now. We're imprisoning persons, individuals with self-awareness and emotional depth comparable to humans, for the amusement of crowds. There's no ethical framework that justifies this once you truly understand what dolphins are. Some captive dolphins can't be released. They were born in captivity, never learned to hunt, would die in the wild. For them, we owe the best possible lives we can provide. Large sea pens, access to open water, the company of other dolphins, freedom from performance demands, retirement sanctuaries, essentially, where they can live out their lives with dignity. For wild dolphins, we owe protection, not just from active hunting, though that continues in some parts of the world and must stop, but from the passive destruction we're inflicting on their environment. Ocean noise, pollution from shipping, and military sonar disrupts dolphin communication and navigation. Plastic pollution kills dolphins who mistake it for food or become entangled. Climate change is warming oceans and disrupting the ecosystems dolphins depend on. We can't partner with dolphins, but we can be better neighbors. We can acknowledge that we share this planet with other minds, other persons, who have as much right to exist and flourish as we do. Second, we owe them continued effort at understanding, but ethically. The research must continue, not because we still hope to use dolphins for our purposes, but because understanding is valuable in itself. Projects like the Wild Dolphin Project show how this can work. Studying dolphins in their natural environment, on their terms, learning from observation rather than control. Technology offers new possibilities that didn't exist in the 1960s. AI can analyze dolphin vocalizations for patterns humans would never detect. Underwater drones can follow dolphins into depths humans can't reach. Non-invasive sensors can gather data about dolphin behavior without capture or confinement. We can learn about dolphins without imprisoning them, and maybe, just maybe, we can still achieve limited communication. Not the full partnership that Lily dreamed of, but something. A shared vocabulary of symbols, perhaps, where both species can indicate basic concepts. Danger, food, play, help. An interface that allows dolphins to request interaction or indicate when they want humans to leave them alone. Enough mutual understanding that encounters between our species can be consensual, respectful, and meaningful for both. Third, and perhaps most important, we owe dolphins the lesson they teach us about the limits of human ambition. We wanted to partner with dolphins on our terms, in our environments, using our definitions of what partnership meant. We expected them to adapt to us, to fit into our world, to become useful in ways that served human purposes. We didn't consider that maybe they didn't want that. That maybe being a dolphin swimming free across hundreds of miles of ocean, diving deep, communicating in ways we can't perceive, living according to their own nature, is better than any partnership we could offer. This is the hard lesson, that other intelligent beings might have their own purposes, their own ways of living, that don't include us, that we're not the center of every story, not the species that every other intelligence should aspire to join. Dogs chose us, or we chose each other, and it worked because our natures were compatible. Wolves could become dogs without losing something essential. They could be pack animals with humans as their pack. They could be happy in our world, but dolphins can't. To truly partner with us, they'd have to stop being dolphins. They'd have to give up the ocean, the depths, the vast ranges, the social structures, the ways of being that make them what they are. And that's too high a price, even for the benefits partnership might bring. So we're left with this: two intelligent species sharing one planet, able to recognize each other, even appreciate each other, but unable to build a life together. We're like neighbors who wave across a fence we can never climb. We can acknowledge each other's existence, even develop a kind of fondness. But we're living in different worlds, and those worlds don't overlap enough for anything deeper. There's melancholy in this realization. We came so close. Those moments when Margaret and Peter connected, when wild dolphins choose to swim with humans, when researchers and dolphins seem to almost understand each other, they hint at what might have been. They show us the edges of a possibility that remains forever just out of reach. But there's also something beautiful in it, because it means dolphins remain themselves. They remain wild, mysterious, other. They're not animals we've bent to our will. They're not subordinates in human civilization. They're equals we can't control, minds we can't fully fathom, persons who exist for their own sake, not for ours. In a world where humans have domesticated, controlled, or eliminated most species we encounter, dolphins represent something rare, an intelligence that remains autonomous. They remind us that the world doesn't exist to serve human purposes, that other ways of being intelligent, other ways of being conscious, are valid even if they're incompatible with ours. Maybe that's what we really lost when the dolphin partnership failed. Not the practical benefits, not the scientific breakthroughs, but the humility of accepting that we're not the only story that matters. That another intelligence looked at what we offered and in effect declined. That we encountered our limits, not in our technology or our ethics, but in the basic fact of what we are versus what they are. Peter died calling for Margaret. That's the tragedy. But millions of dolphins still swim free in the oceans, living according to their own nature, communicating in their own language, pursuing their own purposes that have nothing to do with humanity. That's the hope. We couldn't become partners. We can't bridge the gulf that separates us. But we can do something more difficult and more important. We can let them be. We can acknowledge their personhood, protect their freedom, respect their autonomy, and accept that some minds, no matter how fascinating, no matter how sophisticated, aren't meant to join our story. They have their own story. It's been unfolding for 50 million years, long before humans existed, and it will continue long after we're gone. Our brief moment of intersection, those decades in the 20th century when we tried so hard to connect, is just a footnote in their history. But what a footnote! Because for a moment, two intelligent species recognized each other across the vast gulf of evolution and environment. For a moment, a young woman and a dolphin lived together, learned from each other, cared about each other. For a moment, we glimpsed what it would be like to not be alone in our intelligence. That moment passed. The partnership failed, but the recognition remains. Somewhere in the ocean right now, dolphin is thinking, feeling, communicating, making choices, living a life as rich and complex as any humans. They're persons, even if we can never fully know them. They're minds, even if we can't meet them where they are. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing they exist, acknowledging what they are, fighting to protect their world is the partnership we actually owe them. Not the one we wanted, where they served our purposes, but the one they need, where we respect their right to remain magnificently, mysteriously, eternally themselves. The dream of partnership died, but something more important survived. The recognition that we share this earth with other persons. And that recognition, that humility, that wonder, might be the most valuable thing we got from those decades of trying to talk to dolphins. We couldn't become partners, but we learned we're not alone. And in a universe that seems vast and empty, that might be the most profound discovery of all.